slow reader. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Tuesday, July 21st, 2026. The time is 6:35 p.m. We'll do roll call first. Susan Axelrod. Here. Liz Karp. Here. Paul Jordan.
Here.
Robin Pothier.
Here.
Caper Wilson. Here. Armand Monaco. Here. And Maria Mack is here. Our first agenda item is recommendation to Town Council, Old Tower Hill Road Neighborhood Project Form-Based Code Review and Recommendation to the South Kingstown Town Council. Jamie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. If you just give me a moment, I'm going to get access to the screens here. And I don't expect anyone to actually be able to read everything that's up there. But, so Madam Chair, just as an update, Town Council asked the Planning Department staff to work with legal counsel, go over and refine the document. They're tentatively scheduled to have public hearings on the proposed revisions at their first meeting in September, potentially continuing any public hearings to their second meeting in September. They only meet once in August, and one of the council members was unable to attend that August meeting. So we got a little bit of a reprieve on the timetable, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. So we've worked with Andy Tights, our legal counsel for the town. Andy went back through the document. He made some suggestions, primarily formatting and moving some of the administrative aspects to the beginning of the document versus towards the back. One of the primary changes is on, and I lost my pagination, but has to do with the applicability of the code as it relates to existing buildings and compliance thresholds. This was later on in a document, we'll say page 50 or 60, where we were talking about forms and when forms and setbacks and dimensions applied to applicants. Andy's suggestion was to delete it from that section of the regulations and move it right up front, where we're literally at the beginning of the document talking about form-based codes, and then going down and talking about the structure, how to use the form-based code. And literally the next page of that is section D, which is applicability. And again, it calls out what the thresholds are, when it applies to people, what happens if there's a natural event. And again, we're tying up a lot of the terminology there, consistent with Rhode Island law. And then throughout the document, Andy went through and made certain sections of the regulations consistent with changes in Rhode Island law, made sure references to any waivers or relief within the form-based code immediately went to Unified Development Review so that you can ask for relief under that permitting process. But again, he made some structural changes on the administrative side, but contextual didn't make any suggestions to changes. So build to zone, setbacks, all of those things remain the same. Architectural features are still the same. One thing we did talk about is there seems to be some confusion about the terminology of form-based code. In reality, form-based code is just a different terminology for a tool in a toolbox of zoning. So it's no different than me saying that we've created 5 new zoning districts for the Old Tower Hill Road area. and they're called Neighborhood Core, Neighborhood Central, Main Street Neighborhood. There are 5 distinct districts. Those 5 distinct districts have allowed uses, they have build-to lines, they have setbacks, they have height restrictions, they have landscaping provisions, they have all the kind of normal provisions that a zoning code has. And some members of the public go, this is, brand new to South Kingstown. In reality, it's not. You've had a hybrid form-based code for over 10 years, and it's called South County Commons. One of the probably major differences between Old Tower Hill Road's proposed regulations and South County Commons is it's steering towards a true traditional mixed use. South County Commons is kind of deemed as mixed use, but it's really mixed uses per building, not within a building. So yes, there are mixed uses within South County Commons development, but there are not a mix of uses within a building. So you still have residential separated from service, separated from retail. There is no allowed residential over office. There's no residential allowed over commercial space. It is a hybrid form, but it doesn't truly mix the uses. The provisions contained in the draft for Old Tower Hill Road encourages the actual mixed use of a building. It doesn't prevent someone from doing an entirely retail building or an entire service or office building, but it does allow a developer or an applicant to put residential above first or second floor office, retail, or restaurant space. So it encourages that. It also, on the form side, or how a property is developed, turns that a little bit on its head. Traditionally, we work with setbacks, but there's no requirement that a building be placed on any particular spot within that lot or buildable area. And the form-based code does have language in there which are called build-to lines, which stipulate the placement of buildings within a lot, bringing them towards the street to develop a street-friendly form of development. And again, it's intended to be a walkable, less auto-centric style of development, and this was community-driven, not driven by the plan, necessarily solely by the planning board or the planning department or even the town council. This was, Economic Development Committee, town council, planning board, housing authority, and the planning department working with the community to develop a style of development that seemed compatible with what existed in town and how they wanted the town to develop in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years and into the future. The regulations are only a mechanism to steer development in a particular development pattern to show that vision that the community has come up with. So again, I know the planning board's familiar with the term form-based code, but a lot of people in the community, I think it's something new. It's just a different style wrench that a mechanic would use to fix your car. They've always been fixing your car. You don't ask them what the name of the wrench is. You just want to know whether he can fix it in the same manner as before. So as a planner, form-based code is just another tool. I think we can clarify the mechanism and the terminology and try and relate it more simplistically to the fact that we're proposing 5 new districts within Old Tower Hill Road.
Jamie, to that end, with regard to the terminology, it definitely is planner speak and not necessarily community-friendly. And the folks that attended the 5-day charrette, who were very interested and supportive, we would certainly want them to know that this was coming before the town council. Is there a way in, whether it's on the town website or within the advertising, we can call it something else and then say, also referred to as form-based code, like, I don't know, mixed-use opportunity zone or neighborhood, something.
Andy Tights and I talked about this for, I don't want to say at length, but for a considerable amount of time of how we potentially do that within the regulations. Again, here's an example where we say the form-based districts of South Kingstown neighborhood include. You may see us drop, we may say the following districts for the South Kingstown Old Tower Hill neighborhood include residential neighborhood 1. And then as we go down to neighborhood Main Street 1.5. And again, we're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. We're not trying to downplay the fact that we are using a form-based dialect. I just think in listening to the community, the terminology form-based is foreign to some people, where you as a planning board realize it is just another type of wrench that you're utilizing to fix something. And I think I'll work with legal counsel on how we may do this without making it look totally different than what we've had before, everybody before. But again, we may just simply put neighborhood Main Street first and FB 1.5 after it. So again, getting used to the terminology that we have 5 districts. So residential neighborhood, neighborhood Main Street, neighborhood center, village core, and gateway.
The
Or
other thing,
gateway
Jamie,
neighborhood.
is that if at some point in time, whether it's at the public hearing or elsewhere, you do make that comparison to South County Commons, it might be worthwhile to explain that the design criteria and architecture is more stringent in South County Commons, and this has a greater degree of flexibility in terms of design.
Yeah, and again, I think, South County Commons was a different style of development. It was owned by one group. This is a conglomeration of a number of properties. I think communities are healthier when they have a mix of architecture versus one kind of monotone or nomenclature forms, and this code does that. And we're doing it by example. We've given repeated examples of, flat roofs with heavy cornices versus gable roofs with dog shed or non-dog shed dormers, 2-story versus 3 stories, 4 stories with gables and dormers to hide the 4 stories. So I think we've provided enough variation in architecture and material choices and also codified that. So.
Madam Chair? I'm curious if there's any discussion of the use of color. We talk about forms and roofs and architectural elements, and the reason I ask about colors, I just again noticed the other day when I passed behind Job Lot and those new townhouses, which I think overall look really nice, but they're all the same color, and so it's just this monolithic block. And I think, color has a way of helping to break up some massing a little bit, and it also just, I think, adds interest, variety, character. I think color is one of those things that makes a place unique and interesting. And South County Commons, I think, has the same problem, where those buildings are all just shades of gray and pale blue. If there are a way, require, recommend, whatever we end up doing, but to say, if you're going to put in a row of townhouses, let's add color to the mix.
I think, Paul, you make a good point, Madam Chair, if I may. There is language in there that steers developers away from that repetitive pattern, but also provides for variation. In some aspects, an all-white building looks really good, and if you force color variations, it may not look as aesthetically pleasing. So I think it's a case by case, but to your point, perhaps Holly Street with a little more color variation may have been, one notch above what it is. It's a nice development. Over time, the landscape will grow in, the trees will mature, and it will look more like it belongs to some of the historic streets in town, but that landscape needs to mature. So we do have language in there. I've written language for communities that are, very prescriptive, and I'm not sure we need to do that. I've written language for form-based code where, the building across diagonal couldn't repeat a pattern. You could have no more than, every third building repeat a pattern. And I don't think we're quite at that, but I will, if it's okay with the planning board, look back and make sure it's clear that we are allowing that flexibility, but also giving direction at the same time.
Liz?
Yeah, I did notice in the revised form-based code, you do make a reference to color. There, I think it's, I don't remember exactly where it is, but you talk about reference to vertical elements and maybe use that as a taking off point, and also horizontal elements to add some color. So it is mentioned in there, maybe not to the extent that you're hoping it would be, Paul.
Even if it's just something that we can encourage as developments come in to say, to talk about this, and, if we can't require it, to at least recommend it, say it's something we'd really like to see, but.
And then, Madam Chair, I know a few planning board members have reached out to me about simple typos. We're to the point we're reading this document for the 30th time. I do, you asked for what my strengths are. I'm extremely detailed orientated. What are one of my weaknesses? I'm extremely detailed orientated. So as I reread a document, sometimes I know what the first word is and the fifth word, so I skip the 4 in between. So if someone catches, a comma missing or a repetitive word, I would appreciate that. If someone reads a sentence, and one of my methodologies is if I have to read a sentence 2 or 3 times to figure out what it actually says, maybe I need to reword it. Again, we've read this document. We're very familiar with it, but if you're reading something and it doesn't make sense, you can reach out to Brian, Curtis, or I, have a quick conversation with us, and we'll try and get to that. I'm not here saying every comment that you give us will actually be incorporated or modified. We may agree to disagree on some components, but we'll do our best to make it as legible and understandable as possible.
Robin?
So I did compile a list of some typos. Because there's no page numbers in the slides.
So I will apologize for that. The original document was done in InDesign. InDesign converted it to a PDF. We took the PDF, converted it to a Word document. Then that didn't work so good, so I asked Able City East to convert the iDesign into Word. When we did that, that was probably about a 98% transition. And I noticed as I was going through the document with Andy's changes, for some reason, when I re-PDF'd it and condensed it, I lost the page numbers. So, Rob, please bear with me, but if you wanted to, if you had an opportunity.
Do you want them now, or do you want me to try to, I don't know how to email them as easily without page numbers, but.
If you have them written down, we can make a quick copy of them before you leave tonight, if that's okay with you.
Sure,
Unless
sure.
you feel that there's
Yep.
something in your list that needs explanation.
So I do have 2 questions other than typos.
Okay, thank you.
Under section E, when it refers to signage, is monument sign correct? I didn't know whether that was a typo, or is that proper language?
So I think one of the discussions originally is that you wanted building signage and ground-mounted signage. You wanted to get away from the highway-type pylon signs.
And so is monument sign a real term? or-
Yes, monument sign is, so a
Okay.
monument sign can be referred to as a monument sign or a ladder-style sign. So if you have a development with 10 retail or service individuals, 10 rentable spaces,
Yeah.
each one of those 10 always want to be on the monument sign or on the ladder sign.
Got you.
I've worked with developers in the past to build brand identity with the development, not with individual tenants, because individual tenants change. So if I was Brian Wagner, Esquire, within a development, Brian historically would want one of those ladders or be on the monument sign. What we're trying to work with developers is Brian Wagner would be at Old Colony Road development. And that would be how to find Brian, not by the ladder sign, but by the actual name of the property being developed.
Okay, and then my other question was under Section 7, Administration, where it says that farm-based code is an optional regulatory framework, and I didn't know whether we wanted to keep the word optional in there. That seemed like we had tried to move away from that.
The optional should not be in there. Are you, which section is that in, Robin?
Administration, Section 7?
Section 7?
I also think all the act of God could simply be natural disasters.
Okay.
Yeah, Section 7, Administration, and then it's describing what FBC is, and it offers a definition as an optional regulatory framework.
Yeah, the code is not laid out as optional, so we'll look into that. Yeah.
If you're still looking for that section, it's before the review process. Administration. I think the heading was administration. Yeah, that looks like it could be it. Yes, optional.
Okay, fixed.
And the rest are typos that we'll just photocopy. Thank you.
And
Susan?
again, that's one of the things going back and forth between 3 or 4 reviewers with 3 or 4 formats. Thank you.
Jamie, I have some questions about graphics, and I don't think it'll translate well if I copy the notes I made. Is there some time tomorrow or Thursday that's convenient? And I'll just come in and,
We
Maybe-
can arrange that, Liz.
okay.
Thank
I think
you.
that'd be easier.
Susan?
So a few weeks ago, I stopped by Jamie's office with a whole bunch of questions I had and little typos and things, but I had some more structural questions, and I don't know if we need to talk about those. I've shared those with Jamie. One of the things that I've noticed is that the word street trees is mentioned in one spot in the whole document, and it's in relationship to lampposts. In no other place does it request or require or leave room to install street trees. And so I think that if that's something that's important to us, and it's in all the graphics that we've been sharing and all of the benefit of this, is that I couldn't find any place in this document where we require them, request them, suggest them, or anything else. So I think that that's an oversight here. And I also found a couple of places where there's a graphic in here that shows the streetscape, State Road streetscape improvement area. And it's got the roadway, it's got 8 feet of furnished landscape zone, it's got 8 feet of clear path walking, it's got 5 feet of frontage zone where there's like somebody sitting in a cute little table. So the total there is 21 feet of streetscape improvement area. And in a lot of our graphics, we're showing patios with umbrellas and chairs and outdoor dining. But then when you go to the requirements and for the setbacks, along these state roads, we've got a 12-foot maximum setback between the edge of the pavement and the front of the building. And so there's inconsistency here where if we went with these setbacks that are required in our ordinances, we could never have page 41, which seems to demand 21 feet of setback. And then a lot of the photos show really nice open gardens and streetscape that could never fit with the way the minimum and maximum requirements are set out for setbacks. So I think that if that's our desire, then things need to be adjusted to give us those big, deep sidewalks and streetscapes that we are asking for here. So those are two things that...
Before you move on to the next one, I just want to reiterate what Susan said and how we've had conversations going back from the beginning about the benefit of street trees as far as infiltration of stormwater, reduction of heat island effect, aesthetics, cooling, and so on. So that does need to be a major component within the document so that it is clear from the beginning.
And I've got one more thing that is sort of under my skin. For all of the street front retail, office, restaurants along our corridor, we have a 6-foot minimum step up from the street into the businesses. And a 6-inch step up into every business isn't accessible. We're now requiring ramps or some other kind of accommodation at every one of the businesses that we're requesting along that strip, that if you're in a wheelchair or you have other kinds of mobility issues, every building here is going to be a step up to get indoors, the offices and the restaurants, and I don't understand why that's part of the standard. I brought it up with Jamie when we talked earlier, and I don't know if that's going to be adjusted, but that doesn't feel very accommodating. If you look at all of the zones, the housing zones are like a 10-foot step up. The retail and the commercial is a 6-inch step up to get to the first floor.
So you're talking about a grade change, not a setback.
Yes, a grade change is a 6-foot minimum. 6-inch, God, 6 foot, 6-inch minimum. Like you have to go at least 6 inches up to get into all the retail space. And I'm not understanding why that would be a desirable thing. So that's a couple of my things.
I have a question with our consultant. Again, it's an attempt to elevate the buildings, and I think there may be a slight language disconnect between an elevation of a building as it relates to the sidewalk. Just because the building's elevated doesn't mean the approach to the front door is elevated. So we're going to look at that regulatory language to be accommodating. You know, this isn't a mall setting where you have, you know, flush. Buildings are elevated, and again, they still need to comply with ADA. So they may want to step up, and there may be a ramp system on the side. There may be a small landing area in front of a front door, which is elevated from the normal sidewalk, but then they still have to meet ADA in another mechanism. So again, we're looking at that regulatory language.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts from planning board members? Liz?
I'm kind of hesitant to bring it up. I could talk about it tomorrow, but I'm going to do it. So page 5, I have the PowerPoint here. So it's page 5, which is a graphic, and it's actually the first time form-based codes is mentioned. It's item B. Keep going. Yes, the graphic on the left. When I came to that, and I read the caption underneath it, it says Kingstown Road revived with new investment. And I stopped and I looked at it and I went, oh my God, what, I must be missing something because I didn't understand why we would have a monopoly board as our first graphic of, it just really shocked me, Jamie. To me, it does nothing to introduce our case. So I'll just put that out there.
I had exactly the same response.
If you give me one moment.
Maybe that was the wrong one? The wrong graphic?
No, and I, before you leave, Liz, I will show you an alternative to the monopoly. The intent of those are graphic representations of form. So remember you heard me talk about, you know, how the shoebox, being the shoebox is the building, fits on a property. These are basically shoebox arranged on a redevelopment of a property. They're not intended to represent a strict architectural form. They're there to represent building massing. Okay. And I did, I will show, I do have that re-rendered with a little more architecture associated with it.
Yeah, and talk about color, it's a bunch of ugly brown roofs that,
I did do that.
But in terms of,
Again, the other aspect is, if we're intending to show the form, typology of buildings and density and placement, the caption should reflect that. So again, there may be the appropriate graphic with a less clear caption. If we change the wording of the caption, the graphic would probably be more appropriate. But I'll share with you before you, if you remind me before you leave tonight, I will show you some different renderings for that site. Thank you.
Susan?
So following what Liz just said, in each of the sections, there's a bunch of photographs of examples of, the FB1 or the FB2. Most of these photographs don't fit our regulations. For setbacks and stuff, like most of these buildings are not consistent with our regulations. It's a good example of a cute little house, but it doesn't fit for the setbacks and for the lot coverage. It doesn't, a lot of them don't fit. Like here's one that's got 2 side-by-side townhouses with a little brick patio, looks like the Back Bay of Boston. Like what part of town is that going to go in? I think that some of the photographs really should be reevaluated for their compliance. Like if we're giving examples of what your building could look like, but your building could never look like that because that's not within our requirements, then there seems to be, I think we're setting ourselves up for some confusion here. And Jamie and I talked about this, so I'm all like, that they're representative of what could be, but they couldn't be within our own regulations.
But you have to.
I don't understand what you
Yeah.
mean, because we're not, those photos don't really show the setback per se from the street or the side lot. It's just
and-
architectural, right?
Madam Chair, that's a discussion Susan and I had. Photographs in certain sections of the regulations aren't intended to be representative of the code as it relates to all-encompassing. So they're not photo representative of a setback, the actual landscaping in the code, and all of the little things in the code. Those photos are representative of a style of architecture, a style of building form. So if someone came to you and said, what type of building should I build here? What is the type of architecture the planning board in the town is looking for? These are representative styles of architecture. They would then take that architecture and then put it onto their site and adhere to the dimensional components of the code. So I've showed you some renderings that are close to code compliant, but we're not getting a ruler out to determine whether it's a 10-foot build 2 line or a 12-foot build 2 line. They are so a lot of the things in the code are graphic or pictorial representations of what you're aspiring, but they're not intended to be all-encompassing. One photo doesn't represent code compliance of everything in the code. It represents one component of the code in some aspects. To Paul's point earlier and Robin's point, and as well as Liz, we'll go through the captions and make sure that we clarify that.
So I hate to pile on, but I have the same reaction when I look at a lot of the photos. And I wasn't thinking so much about the setbacks and the building envelope, so much as just styles of architecture like Back Bay brownstones that would never, I'm trying to think of a place in South Kingstown where a row of Back Bay brownstones would look appropriate. And so I think, again, to Susan's point, people, and maybe not so much developers, but a lot of people are going to look through this, they're going to read through this, and people look at the photos. Nobody's going to read this document the way we are. They're going to look at the photos and they're going to say, that's what you want for South Kingstown? So I realize you're a long way in here, and I'm not asking you to change anything that's not easy to change, but if there's a way to find, I think a lot of those are great examples of what we might see, but just to maybe go through and find more appropriate photos. And again, if that's a heavy lift and it's too late, I'm okay with that. But I just think people will look at this and they'll just question us. You really think we're going to build that here?
So I'm just going to focus on this one, top left, well, it's the left on my screen, but you have brick, you have clapboard, you have some detail, brick arch, and then you have limestone. There's no expectation that someone's planting gonna build limestone in this new corridor, but this photo is representative of mixed-use
Right.
buildings and enclosed public spaces. So it's not intended to
Right, but
talk to materials.
But
It's-
this one's kind of reminiscent of what we already have on Main Street, this mix of
Right.
styles and architectures and
I would
dates
say
for
if someone
construction.
has, we'll use the term anxiety about a particular photo,
I have to go.
and it's if you can just let us know, and we'll try and do our best.
I was
to-
hoping we'd have printed copy. I didn't print one out yet, but I'll do that
Okay.
and go through it.
All right.
Thanks.
We did have a couple of Florida images early on that we got rid of. Yeah, no, just,
Palm trees you didn't think would work here?
But, and I'll be done, that page that we just had up that had that mixed-use thing, you have 6 examples on that page of FB4 architecture, but none of those have that. If you look at the page right before it, it shows this big old wide sidewalk with trees and patio stuff. None of those examples show anything like that aspirational picture we have on the page before it, and none of our setbacks would permit it, that wide sidewalk.
So,
So do we have an example of a real building that has a nice big wide sidewalk that we're aspirational to, as opposed to these ones that are just right up on the street with little 5-foot sidewalks? Like, is there a way to make some of the pictures at least fit what we're aspirationally hoping for? Now I'll be done.
Okay, so I understand, again, I understand the points you're making. This is the aspirational rendering. These talk about elements of buildings. They're looking at components of buildings, and I'll blow this up. So again, this is an example of mixed use in apartments that can be located in the same zone. This rendering or picture is talking about storefront windows providing interest for pedestrians. This is the drawing here is height and massing of a 4-story building. And to the right is the 3-story building. Sheldon's is 4 stories. The 4 stories is encompassing a mansard roof. The drawing to the left is how a shallow build 2-zone locates buildings at the sidewalk, which again, you may have a side street or an element where they are pulled up to the sidewalk. The building below is talking about the mixed use and how it interacts with a public space. The 3 to 4 story mixed use transitional to residential uses in neighborhood centers. So it's hard within a regulatory document to hit every aspect of every component. They're intended to be representative.
If I may, Jamie, when you started your explanation, the heading of this section of pictures was examples. And it would help if you expand that heading, instead of just saying examples, if you say it's examples of building components within this, that would, what you think you need to do, what
So like a disclaimer. This is
Well, no,
not
what we're-
meant
what we're
to,
t- What we're
yeah.
trying to do is focus you on what you're looking at here. I think your example of putting your descriptive heading first and then putting your numbering terminology is an excellent one, because what you're basically saying is we're expecting our readers, our audience, to be lay people as much as builders. And so you're helping to educate, and I understand that your document needs to do both, but I think that it needs to be looked at from the standpoint of who is the reader that you're trying to address. And the problem is you've got several different readers that you're trying to address. So let's identify who are the different readers we want to address and go through it. I happen to be a very good proofreader. If you want somebody to read through the whole thing, I'm happy to do that, but I need a printed version.
You know, I said this at the onset that we work on the regulatory side, right? So when I see this as someone who's read the document maybe too many times, I understand what these examples represent. But for someone who may be reading it for the first time, or a planning board who's diving deeper into it as the regulation's been refined, still saying, wait, I'm a little confused, or this title is misleading, getting this feedback from you is good. It helps us refine and work on the language to make it more user-friendly. So.
they also represent something that's slightly out of the norm, because ordinarily you might see 20 pages of text and very little diagrams or photos. So this changes it and improves it for sure.
And if you recall, during some of our presentations, we did a lot of line drawing examples for the mere fact that if we added color, someone would have said, I don't like the color of the awning, versus looking at the building form, they didn't like the stripes, why isn't it solid? So in some things, we stuck to basic, and you've had me do this before in some presentations where when we're talking about architecture, I did everything in black and white. I did it very monochrome. I didn't use colors because colors are very perceptive and personal. If all of these maybe were in black and white, maybe it would be better. Maybe I'll run a version of that by you. But again, they're, you know, to my title, they're examples of various building forms and components. They're not honing in on one building style.
I keep saying one more. So the picture before this, the page before this, shows that little village center that's got a big wide, that whole thing. If you go forward 2 pages to the FB4 building form regulations, the front build-to-zone setback is a minimum of 5 feet and a maximum of 10 feet. So you could never achieve that visual if you go to our regulations, which is minimum 5 feet, maximum 10 feet setback from the curb.
Definitely
So
more
we'll
than
never
10
have
feet.
that. So if that's what we're looking for, then I think we need to give people space to create that, or mandate that they create that. If that's the vision that we're selling our people in our town, that's what they're going to get, I think we need to make that possible within the regulations.
So what you're taking, Susan, is a visual representation and trying to put a dimension to it.
Then don't, you know what, Jamie, then don't show this picture to people and then put in the regulations that that's not possible.
If you let me finish, on the street, that's a 4-foot landscape island and a 6-foot sidewalk for 10 feet to the building. But you're trying to look at a graphic representation and nail it to within inches of something. And it's
Also, on another
two
page-
people, Susan, right here, 2 people are walking abreast. That's approximately 6 feet wide, and this is less than that, which is approximately 4 feet wide, for plus or minus 10 feet. Maybe it's 12. It's a graphic representation of a style. It's not intended to be representative of the dimensions of the code. It's a graphic representation of what you're trying to achieve.
Bait and switch.
I think that the initial premise for having the 5 to 10 feet was to avoid the all too common, let's put parking lots in front of the buildings like we now have, or detention areas, or what have you, to get away from that and have the buildings closer to the street. That said, with something like this, at this scale, which is a large portion of a parcel, you would need to be able to have some flexibility if you were going to do something of this mass and scale. I mean, it's not a terrible example. Maybe it's being taken too literally, but again, maybe there needs to be some flexibility, but again, not allowing cars parked in front of all these buildings like we now have.
And I want to say this too, if a development came in with this configuration, we'll just say graphic configuration, and that sidewalk happened to be, the landscape island was 5 feet wide, and the sidewalk was 8 feet wide, for a total of 13 feet, and your regulation said 10,
Yep.
are you okay with what's shown here graphically? Because if I asked you from the edge of the table to a point in the carpet, is it 10 or 13 feet, most people wouldn't understand what that dimension is. So again, I think Maria made a point that you're looking at a graphic representation of a style of development that shows parking behind, public space between the buildings, landscaping at the street, a sidewalk that is more than just 2 people to walk on. It's actually a little bit wider. There's a section where a building is pushed back to accommodate outdoor dining. There's a section where the building's pushed a little bit closer, and parking's behind or to the side of these buildings. To me, from a regulatory standpoint, if a developer comes in with an application and gets pretty close to this, a foot or 2 left or right of the regulatory side, they're trying to be as code compliant as they can be. You could come to look at a development and say, I'm looking at the dimensions and I know our regulations say 10, can you push it to 12? You may ask for a little bit more, and there may be a scenario where 8 works. But again, this is a graphic representation of a style of development.
I think we get that. If you were going to pick apart this rendering, the humans do look very small, and the corner building does look like it's more like a 20-foot setback, whereas the one that's labeled side street could be 10.
What's that? 21 feet.
Yep. So it might be an opportunity to explain the inherent flexibility that should be part of the code.
Or perhaps a compromise might be on that corner where we have the 4 tables with umbrellas. What if we made that 3 tables with umbrellas?
Sorry, Liz?
Where you have the 4 tables with umbrellas,
Yes.
what if that became 3 tables with umbrellas, with some more landscaping or pushed back? It just makes it, now, I understand what you're trying to do here, and I think that your title is very clear. You do say illustrative example and site arrangement, and I think that's clear. But maybe to sort of soften the difference, the dimensions between just the pedestrians walking and people sitting at tables, maybe there's a way to
I just
make
did that.
There you go.
No.
You just smush it right in.
So, again, I don't mean to oversimplify it, but again, for me as sitting here on the planning side, who's going to be responsible for the regulatory, I understand what this represents. I work with the development community for 39 years now. I'm pretty confident that the development community will understand what you're looking for, and they need to take this drawing and make it code compliant, and where they can't, have a discussion about what flexibility exists.
Well, and I also think all the graphics, whether they're photographs or they're renderings like this, there has to be an emotional component to them. There has to be something about the graphic that that makes you want it.
I'm just going to show you one thing real quick, if I can pull it up.
And just to add, Jamie, where planners and developers will understand this immediately, you still have public hearings coming up before the town council where the public needs to be convinced, the town council needs to be convinced, and the folks that this applies to really need to be convinced. And so any of these sort of confusing points, while they're not lost on you, are going to be lost on them. I think, arriving at the simplest, clearest explanation for what this is and what it's about, and I think that has been done, maybe just because I've been paying attention a little bit, but, a lot of people aren't paying attention. So the clearer we can make this, and the more our examples sort of reflect exactly what we're looking for, the better off we're going to be.
I agree. I mean, that large stone building does not exactly scream coastal South County.
So here's an example that we used in a presentation to town council, okay? And you can debate the merits of how wide the sidewalk is, but this is an aesthetic look you're going for. The double gable building, we just had a conversation with a developer who potentially will be utilizing that as one of their building forms for an upcoming development. And they were pleased to see this in one of our renderings because it matched some of the architecture they were looking at and were tracking in the presentations before the council. And this is potentially a Main Street development. So they understood what the graphic representation was, and one of their comments was, if we did a style like this, how would that be received? And we explained to them that our opinion was it would potentially be well received because it's some of the styles the town council and the planning board have been evaluating, as well as other members of the community have been evaluating. So again, this is a graphic representation. The sidewalk here could be anywhere between 15 and 18 feet. Something narrows up. Those are two tops for tables, so they're only, anywhere from 24 to 36 inches wide, so that's 3 feet, and then you have a 5-foot sidewalk, and then how wide is that landscape? So again, it's a graphic representation of a style, and it's not intended to represent exact code compliance with a dimension. But
Anything else?
the points that are made, believe me, they're well thought out, and they will get us to look and evaluate and rethink how we're wording some things within the document.
That works.
Anything else? Armin?
Well, my understanding is the code is the text. All the diagrams, unless they're specifically identified in the text, they're just illustrations of what may be. So what will govern us will be the text. And, I find the discussion interesting because it reminds me of a situation that developed in the town of East Greenwich several years back. They were very concerned about signage. So they had this commission to study the signage law. They spent, I don't know how many hours going over it, making changes. They enacted it, and then a developer came to town and put up a shopping center. And he said, I want to put a sign up that's 30 feet tall. And they said, you can't do it. The ordinance says signs can be no more than 2 feet off the ground. He said, yes, but there's nothing in the ordinance that addresses shopping centers. So he built this 30-foot tall sign. It's still there. And I think we're going to have the same problem. The more we try to massage this, it'd be like kneading a piece of dough. You can keep kneading it and kneading it and kneading it, and eventually it goes flat because you needed it too much. I think we need to get this moving. I think it's been a long time. Everyone has their own viewpoint, and so we'll never be able to get a document that's going to be satisfactory to everyone. But I think if the text is written, and I trust that Andy has looked at it and spent a lot of time going over the text, because the ordinance is the text, not the photographs or the illustrations, because again, they're not drawn to scale. So you can't say, well, this is exactly what it says, because it's not drawn to scale. So I think it's time to put it to the council, let the people come in, let them express their opinions, and then decide whether or not it's satisfactory. It's going to take a while for this to be accepted, because it's change. We were talking about change the other day, and how someone said, you can't have change. I said you have to have change, because you have to adapt to what's changing. Life is not static. Life changes. So we have to make some changes. And I think I've been enthusiastic about this concept, but I think it's time to move it forward.
Anyone else? All right, thanks, Jamie.
Just,
Oh,
Madam Chair, with
Yep.
that being said, I know the planning board discussed at a previous meeting about working on the draft motion, and also, going potentially beyond the normal findings and coming up with a list or bullet items. I think Susan used the terminology of bullet items for why the planning board thinks this is a good option for the community, is an acceptable development pattern that requires this style of regulatory language. I don't know if it would be pertinent to have a 3-person subcommittee to help planning board staff come up with those bullet items, or does the planning board just feel comfortable having the planning department prepare those items for you that you'll review?
Well, we'll have another work session before the hearing.
Okay.
So if staff prepared something, then we can all,
Okay. If
Add our
anybody has
comments.
any ideas or wants to see a few sentences put in, I
yeah, well,
would
nobody's
encourage you
shy
to,
about making
encourage you to
comments
send
from-
them to us. So,
Certainly. So, yeah, adding it to the narrative, which is an important part of the,
And this is a letter?
it's a narrative that goes along with the text and the.
so
Like in a letter format, like dear town council, like what's the?
So there's the formal aspect of it. Dear, town council, the planning board took the following action at a meeting. The motion was, and the language associated with that. They came to the following findings. They're making the following recommendations. This is, a community-sponsored change. This is tasked by the planning board to bring this to, a final product. So there was discussion at our last meeting that, say you make those normal 8 to 10 findings. Those findings are based on Rhode Island law, but they may not go far enough to clearly explain why you would like this to happen. And that is my recollection of the
Yeah.
discussion, where some of the planning board members say, either as an expansion of the findings, or an addendum to the findings, or a bullet list, or a statement to include kind of where we were, where we are, and where we would like to be, and why.
Yeah, I mean, similar to a narrative or a memo that might precede an application for a project.
Okay.
Also, can you clarify, now you said September, you said it will be the first meeting of September, but then continued to the second meeting of September, and do you have a date for those? And explain the, yeah. Just because if it's advertised for a specific date in September and people show up and then they continue it, that could be less effective as far as community input.
So I have the first town council meeting as September 14th. And maybe it's presumptuous of me, but if there are, we'll say 5 people in the audience and 5 people comment, the town council may choose to close the public hearing that evening. If there's 50 people who have comments, they may decide to keep it open. Their second meeting in September is September 28th. So I want to say, in my experience, a lot of times a change of this magnitude may go for 2 nights. Yeah. Understanding that public hearings are in the middle of the council's agenda.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, is this, rather than a special meeting for this item, this is just going to be added on to whatever items are on?
It's my understanding it would be placed on a regular agenda. There's always the possibility that they, after that initial meeting, say we need to pull this off the norm and continue this to its own night, but I'm not aware of that. Again, we're a month away from advertising.
One last thing while we're on this. When you have something that is ready for review, I know a couple of people have talked about proofreading, and I'm actually pretty good at that too. Yeah, when you have something, if you just want to send it out to all of us, and expecting there may be further revisions, but certainly we can go through and start looking at it and find those typos for you and whatnot.
We do have a board of editor types, so it seems, so, yeah. Let's move on to our next agenda item, zoning ordinance regulation on farm stands.
Again, Madam Chair, just, my intent tonight is just to give a broad overview of what the town council is potentially tasked, the planning board, the town's legal team, as well as the planning department. The structural aspect of farms and farm stands and events and accessory uses for farms are very structured within the town's existing regulations. In essence, there are small farms, medium farms, and large farms. Primarily, the entry-level aspect to farming is a minimum of 5 acres in this community. The council is asking the planning board to look at farm-type activities that may fall below 5 acres and what type of regulatory items would be associated with smaller micro farms on smaller tracts of lands, and then what type of ancillary uses you would allow for them. So again, if you look, in my experience in rural and suburban communities in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts is usually there's a tiered system. And I've talked to the chairman about this, and there's an attorney in Connecticut, Mark Brandt, who's one of the leading land use attorneys, who always uses the example of, you start out with a 200-acre farm with a large farm stand, and over 30, 40 years, the farm gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but the farm stand never gets smaller. So a 200-acre farm with a 3,000 square foot retail outlet is appropriately scaled. Then the 200 acres goes to 100 acres, then the 100 acres goes to 50, the 50 goes to 20, and the 20 ends up being a 10-acre strawberry patch, but you still have a 3,000 square foot farm retail outlet for a 10-acre strawberry patch. So it's kind of, what comes first, chicken, egg, how do you scale, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate. Again, council has asked us to look at what regulations potentially could be developed for farms that are smaller than 5 acres, and what type of regulatory provisions would you put into a regulation for those types of entities. So I don't know if there's any questions on that.
So I read the memo that Amy wrote, and then the letter from the neighbors, and looked at some of the photos. This particular site up on Rodman Street. And it's like the current ordinance says you can't have a farm stand, but it doesn't say anything about farming. on a quarter acre or
So,
a half acre
yeah.
lot. And so my question is, do we have the authority, or is there state law? People have mentioned right to farm. I mean, is it allowable to turn your yard into a big vegetable garden?
So that is, I'll
Before
defer
you-
to, yeah.
I think we should have comments from legal counsel, because we have been asked specifically to look at the farm stands
Right.
rather than, anything.
So I think there's a distinction to draw between growing vegetables and how you sell them.
Mhm.
So the state law says that in all zones, you can't preclude people from vegetative, I think vegetative agriculture is the word, or plant agriculture is what the Rhode Island general laws say. So that means, growing plants either for yourself or to sell. But there is no state law mandate that zoning has to allow, say, a farm stand or a store on that same property.
Right.
So that's where it comes down to the local zoning. And for our zoning here, basically it doesn't recognize a farm that's less than 5 acres for purposes of putting a farm stand on. So the issue is how we could maybe change the zoning so it has something that's appropriate for under 5 acres, because now there's really, it doesn't cover anything that small, essentially.
I mean, I guess my point is, and again, in looking at the letter from the neighbors, is that the issues seem to be about the farm, the large greenhouse, the hoop house, the issues with manure, maybe. And addressing the farm stand doesn't address any of that. So I'm sort of wondering why we're looking at
That's
it.
not what we were asked to do, that's the thing, is we weren't asked to look at that particular.
No, we're asked to look at the,
We're
right.
looking at, the zoning language, how it would apply to the town as a whole, not any specific individual. We've always been told, you don't want to go there, you want to look at what you were tasked to do and go from there.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do, is so I don't understand it seems like the only thing we could do is to allow the farm stand. We could say, yes, if you've got a quarter acre, you can have a farm stand. Currently, it says you can't.
Well,
Amy's memo.
actually, I don't think that's quite right.
Yeah.
I think we're being asked to focus on the farm stand, but right now, the zoning for the farm stand envisions a specific definition
Size.
around that. Whereas when you think about what kind of stands are operative in residential neighborhoods now, I mean, you've got these free, those libraries that people have put up
Right.
that, and they're not for sale, but they're, I don't want to say you can't do that. I think they're an advantage in neighborhoods. Similarly, in my neighborhood, there's a cute little, looks just like the free library, except it's got plants in it. And there's a jar that, suggests that you put in a recommended, usually, this particular one, you put in what you want. And again, that, to me, that's scale appropriate in a residential neighborhood. But if we're talking about, the current farm stand, I forget the dimensions of the stand, but it's,
Can I just, I haven't been tasked, nor has the department or the planning board been tasked to write a regulation for a particular property to allow them to continue to
Right.
do what they are doing for the property. We are tasked with looking at regulatory requirements for smaller farms townwide. So we're not getting, I don't want to get site.
Is it smaller
Less than
farms
5 acres.
specific? I
So-
think the question that you presented was not the question that I read in the documents that I reviewed. So I'd like a clear articulation of the question that we're being asked to address.
And also, in that conversation, Amy's memo does mention the mechanism that currently exists, and that would be worthy of discussion at some point as well.
My intent tonight was to introduce the subject matter to you for what you're kind of tasked with. We can bring more clarity to it, but I think to Caper's point, everyone's paying. If you're going to look at a farm stand you would assume that in order to have a farm stand on a property, there's probably some aspect of farm or plant growth on the property, or are you just going to allow retail sales of plant products on any residential property devoid of a farm? So there are layers to the structure of this regulations. I've written a lot in a number of communities. That's why I used my example of, you start with a 200-acre farm, and over the years it gets smaller, but the retail operation doesn't stay proportionate to the diminished acreage of the farm. So I think in most communities, the larger the farm, the bigger the retail you have. The smaller the farm, the smaller retail you have. The larger the farm, the more things you can do, events, food courts, corn mazes. The smaller the farm, maybe the less things you can do. So we want to look at the structure of retail as it relates to agricultural activities. We're just going to make recommendations to the planning board and kind of give you options of how perhaps other communities have addressed this, how it potentially can be addressed to South Kingstown. But we have to come up with some language that is generally applied to all properties that may be eligible to do whatever this regulation says you can do. Right now, the regulation says you can't do retail sales unless you have 5 acres or more.
Can you have farms in residential neighborhoods? I understand that state
Yes.
law says
Yes.
you can have,
Yes,
you can have.
you can.
Yes.
Agriculture is allowed in every zone in this community.
Okay.
Although, as the code is written now, if your farm is under 5 acres, it's not a farm pursuant to the town code. So that's basically the issue that we have to.
So if you're not a farm, can you have a farm? You can't have a farm stand.
Correct. That's why no one who has less than 5 acres
Okay,
can have a
so-
farm stand right
So
now.
where can you have a farm? I understand you can grow things, but where can you have a farm? What,
So the way the regulations are structured right now, if you have 5 or more acres and you have productive agricultural land on that 5 or more acres, you then are allowed to do certain uses within your agricultural property. And again, there's a list of things you can do, but you can't do it if you have 4. You can only do it if you have 5 or more. What the council has kind of tasked us to is there's somewhere between 0 and 5 where there may be a need or a missing need for this type of use in a smaller scale, similar manner to larger farms and larger retail outlets.
so you use the term micro farms. I'm not familiar with micro farming. So what kind of acreage are we talking about for micro farms? I'm just trying to get an understanding of,
We haven't
I
defined
understand,
it.
it's so we have to pick it up. but-
It's just the term used to, have a conception of what does not
Right.
exist in the
Right.
code right now, which is farms under 5 acres. So it's not, I don't think the code differentiates between the uses. I mean, you can have a farm that's between 5 and 10 acres anywhere, as far as I understand, because that's the state law. You can't say that there's not farming in a zone. So the only thing that we don't have a provision for now in the code is for, when we say micro farms, we mean farms that are under.
Okay, so we're really talking about commercial then? I mean, but when do we allow commerce?
It's not commerce. It's not, agriculture is not considered commercial per se in the traditional sense.
The problem is you can only have a farm stand at a farm. And you can only have a farm if it's 5 acres or more.
But we're trying to step outside the box and create a new scenario.
Right.
So right now, you can't have a farm stand without a farm. But we're being asked to envision what could be. So it's possible that you could have a farm stand without having a farm.
I mean, it could be, but I think what Jamie is saying is that you risk, disproportionate. I think there's some benefit to having, a farm stand actually related to a farm, So it doesn't just become retail, like as Jamie was saying.
Well, what I'm wondering is if we shouldn't be thinking about coming up, forget farm stand, leave the farm stand definition the way it is, but coming up with a vehicle for enabling communities to benefit from having vegetative production in smaller scale environments, and having some sort of ability to have the community interact with that and procure that. I mean, that doesn't have to be, we don't have to call it a farm stand. We don't have to lock into the current definitions. We can think about what we want to enable in the communities, and they could differ depending on the type of neighborhood that you're dealing with, right?
So if I get your sense, Caper, farms and farm stands, let's leave that in the box that it is, create something new like community agriculture or something like that, and build a set of rules around that. Okay.
I like that idea, too. I mean, two things. One is looking at the third paragraph of Amy's memo. Relief from this minimum acreage requirement is available by special use permit. So I would imagine case by case, the special use permit, if it's requested, would look at the individual circumstances and say, you know what, we'd really be happy if you took that compost manure pile and moved it over here, you know, away from your neighbor's house. That, so we can address those things individually. As far as the community agriculture, I mean, I think the idea that we ought to be growing more of our own food, I hate to say I'm getting anxious about climate change, but when all of our food comes from California, you know, the idea that there's local produce available, I thought, oh, well, anybody can go to the farmer's markets, not realizing that you have to pay to be a vendor at the farmer's market. So, you know, I don't know what the answer is, but it sounds like it's possible to get your farm stand if you really want it, with some conditions. So I guess I'm just still not clear why the council, I feel like we need more direction on this.
And by the way, what you said about needing more, you know, agriculture, Wendell Berry's been saying that, if anyone has ever read any of his books, for 50-something years.
I mean, can you imagine it, you know, World War II victory gardens?
Yeah.
I don't know how to grow a tomato. I could probably figure it out.
Paul, I think the problem is that the council is equally
Baffled.
at a loss,
Yeah.
and they're coming to you for direction. So this may be something that has to play out in a
gonna need some
number of different iterations before everybody agrees on how we're going to land on this. And
Yeah.
again, I think this was put on the agenda to be exactly what it is right now, which is a very preliminary
Good.
sort of look at this.
And also, or go ahead. I was just gonna say, I wasn't at the council meeting where this was discussed, but I watched the YouTube video. So I think they're aware that there is a special use permit that can sort of, you know, fill in the gap. But I think that they're troubled that there's not something actually in the code itself that addresses farms that are smaller than 5 acres, and they want to workshop that.
And it seems as though it would be very worthwhile to do a little research and see what other communities and other states are doing. Susan?
So I have a question which isn't totally irrelevant. If I was an artist or a crafty person or a baker, could I set up a little display in front of my home where I sold my little, I don't know, yeah, where I sold my little crafty things? And does that, if that's possible, then the term farm and the attachment of the word farm then becomes not part of the discussion, because if I can sell my driftwood creations in a little stand in front of my house, or my books, or whatever I've got out there, then the definition of farm doesn't matter if there can be a little entrepreneurial industry at certain locations in town. Or is it just agricultural projects? Can I do my key lime pies out there? Like, what's the rule, and does it have to be connected to a farm to have this kind of entrepreneurship?
Susan, if I can just touch upon that. In a lot of communities, rural, suburban, mostly, there's that type of discussion. And a lot of communities will start with home occupations, and then they'll get into home-based businesses, home-based cottage industries, and everything gets structured and tiered. So if you have a home occupation, in most instances in the regulatory side, that home occupation is I work on my computer, but no one comes to my house. It's usually a permitted use as of right. Come to the zoning official, show them the bedroom you're converting to your office or where your computer is. You get a permit to operate a home occupation. Then you become an attorney whose work not just works from home, but he wants to see clients. Some communities then elevate that to a home-based business. Different slight permitting structure. Visitors are now going to enter the site. You have to now accommodate parking. You have to have a safe passage and entry. You have to have a dedicated space. That's a home-based business. Then someone says, well, I have a business partner and I want 2 attorneys. I want an employee. Then some structure that to be a home-based cottage industry. Requires more parking, more access, maybe less signage. But you can layer structure to all of these. What I was trying to explain a little bit earlier is it's simpler when things are 5 acres, 10 acres, and they look like a farm, traditional farm. You see corn in the field, you see plants in the ground. There's a whole different industry with hydroponics and someone asked the terminology of microfarm. Microfarming is not a made-up term. Microfarming can be defined many ways. There's microfarming in urban scenarios where they're growing hydroponically within sea containers under bridge abutment, bridges, because they don't need the sun, they don't need anything. You literally can buy a sea container fully set up to grow plants and vegetables. That's a version of microfarming in an urban setting. There's a variation there. Other communities have dealt with this. I think the structure is how much retail you can have based on how much farm you have. If you are on a smaller parcel, how big can your retail be? If you're on 1 acre, can you have the same size retail as a farmer who's on 100 acres growing 100 acres of crops versus you're growing only 1 acre versus crops? I don't have the answer to that question tonight. It's something we need to explore. It's a conversation we need to do in this type of workshop setting. So I think we have enough information to potentially look at some examples around New England, as Maria has suggested, and put a model or a couple of models out there for the planning board to react to, and then people who may be affected by this regulatory change to also react to.
It's also worth getting some information from DEM. Ken Ayers, who was the chief of agriculture and forestry for 30-something years, has recently retired, but there's an interim person, and it's always good to get information from them. Anything else?
And again, just as I've had some communities who allow events if you have a farm, but they never defined what a farm was. So someone buys a 2-acre piece of land, has a 1-acre hayfield and says, I have a farm. They can, in some communities, generate $2,000 to $3,000 of revenue from that hay annually. So they meet the state definition of farm, and now they go to the community and say, I want an event center. Those communities never anticipated an event center on a 2-acre piece of land as an accessory use to a farm. They expected the wedding venue on the 100-acre apple orchard.
Yeah.
So
Well,
again,
we've had to deal with,
in my experience,
10
there's
plus weddings a
a
year.
hierarchy and structure to scalability of the uses allowed on these type of properties.
All right, thank you, Jamie. What does our regular session next week look like?
We have the map and text amendment, we have 2001 Kingstown Road, and then potentially continued discussion on the regulatory changes associated with Old Tower Hill Road. Sorry, 2001 Kingston Road, that was the 5-unit residential development. So,
What was the first one?
first one was the map change and zoning amendment for the shooting venue
Oh.
by Brad Waugh.
28th.
Is the 28th.
And,
The third item was the regulatory changes to Old Tower Hill Road.
and traditionally, we have always had our elections in July.
Okay.
Okay. Motion to adjourn from someone?
I'll make that motion.
Motion from Caper, second from Paul. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries unanimously.